So, good morning, I'm Jackie Bucat from the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. And so I'm pleased to introduce this video for the Corrigan Farm Improvement Group. So I've been working in canola agronomy for 10 years and we all know how important canola is to the farming system. So in 2021 we had record yields of canola, over 3 million tonnes produced, and a peak value over $1,000 a tonne. So that's $3 billion for the agricultural economy. And in 2022 we're looking even greater things. We've got 1.8 million hectares, so generally it's 1.2 million hectares, so a large increase in the area that's grown, and we're looking again for record yields. So canola is important. And while there's many things to put together for a profitable canola crop, paddock selection, nitrogen, weed control, variety, and I've just finished the latest canola variety guide. But the key success factor for canola is establishment. And most growers breathe a sigh of relief when they go to the paddock and they can see a good emergence of canola. But on the farm, it's actually generally an average of 50% establishment that we get. So of every 2 viable seeds that you're planting, only one of them turns up to be part of your crop. So obviously the germination is mostly affected by the amount of rain. But as the season progresses and gets later, we find growers tending to seed on marginal moisture conditions. And the other time that can happen is if growers have dry seeded and then we have a very light rain. Also it's very tricky. But it's also affected by the level of non-wetting, the position of the seed in the furrow, and obviously the soil type. So they're the primary drivers that affect the moisture availability to the seed. And soil wetters can manipulate that microenvironment by reducing the non-wetting of the soil, drawing moisture to the seed. So they have the effect of increasing the moisture availability of the seed and can increase the establishment. So getting a good canola establishment is obviously really important for your yield and profitability. And we still see that as being important with the price of hybrid seed and some growers reducing the seeding rates to risky levels. But it's also really important for weed control, so getting the break crop benefits of the canola crop. And we see that kind of in 2 situations. If the overall establishment is really low, it's a problem. We need to have at least 20 plants per square metre for that crop competition effect to help with the weed suppression for effective weed control. So when there's an open crop canopy, it's really hard to have good weed control. And the other time we see that as a particular problem is when we get the staggered emergence. So we have the canola and the weeds from the first emergence, and when we've finished the crop or the weed control for that emergence, we're still getting weeds emerging from the subsequent germinations. So that obviously happens with different soil types in the paddock. And if we can use the soil wetters in that situation to generate a more even establishment and more reliable establishment across the paddock, then that will be hugely valuable to the WA farming systems. So they're the issues we've been dealing with for canola ever since we've been growing canola. But on top of all that now we've got climate change. And as we all know, that's reduced rainfall events during autumn. So reduced break of season in effect, as well as reduced rain over the growing season, but increased temperatures over the growing season. And where we get hot spells, there's more of them, they're hotter and they're longer. So there are several risk factors for early seeding, very early seeding, but again, canola establishment is one of the key ones. But some of the other ones, the need for follow-up rain, and that's particularly if you're seeding in the northern environment with very hot conditions. The risk of frost at the end of flowering, the higher risk of predation, so insects, birds, animals, but particularly green peach aphid or diamondback moth, because their numbers can increase when we have the very early break and the green bridge. We also have extended exposure to disease, and there can be problems with weed control. But if we just consider the moisture at establishment, obviously when we're seeding very early, it's not in a marginal moisture situation. Growers are waiting until we have really good moisture, so that's not a problem straight after the seeding event. But the area they can seed is limited by the drying profile of the soil. So here again is a great opportunity if we can use the soil wetters to extend the moisture window, we can get more hectares sown in that time. So that would be particularly valuable. So I expect we'll continue to see early seeding be a major part of the canola farming where the opportunity presents, because it ameliorates most of those problems of climate change. We've already discussed extending the seeding window ameliorates the lack of seeding rainfall events. But if we seed early, we have an earlier maturation of the canola crop, and that helps us to evade any of those hot temperature spells at the end of flowering, which are particularly damaging to canola. And also with the higher temperatures and the reduced growing season rainfall, we're finding that the terminal drought is going to be earlier and more extreme, and again the early maturation of the crop will alleviate that pressure. So from my statewide role, I've been really amazed at the speed that change happens within the farming community, and also that the fit for each area and farm business with different soil types, rainfall, different machinery and labour or different advice, find a way to make things work for their business. And I've also been very impressed with the growers' willingness to experiment and develop new systems. So we see that all coming together here. Wetters are a relatively new technology. We've seen that they're useful in many situations and being adopted by more and more growers. And here we have, it's really valuable that the Future Drought Fund is working with CFIG and local growers to find the optimal methods for the local area. So in conclusion, obviously canola establishment, critical importance for yield and for weed control, and if the wetters can assist, particularly at those really valuable times of reducing the staggered emergence and in the early seeding opportunities, then that's really valuable for growers and leading to more robust systems and more profitable canola systems. Thank you.
Yeah, Damon Flay. I've been with Socoa for the last 9 years. Pretty much started developing SE14 as a trial product when I started in replicated field trials, and we've sort of progressed that from replicated trials through to broadacre trials, skip row trials with using farmers' gear. It's developed into a commercial product as we know it today. Traditionally we started in the forest gravels. They were probably the easy hit. So we had quite a lot of market penetration down the Albany Highway and either side of that, where the forest gravels were really presenting non-wetting issues to crops like canola. But as the product has progressed and we've done more trials, we've sort of pushed further east where dry sowing of canola and lupins was becoming an issue in getting marginal rainfall events after dry sowing, and we found that using the product when you were dry sowing, we're getting better emergence on limited rainfall after that dry sowing using the soil wetter. We've also had some growth in the hay areas where the guys are using it with hay because they're finding getting even germination with their oats when they're coming to mow their hay. It's actually curing in a faster time on the ground because it's all matured at the same time, because it's germinated at the same time, so they're getting less variation. So less time on the ground is less risk to the hay grower. Yeah, well, I guess some of the challenges people might face are setting their bars up to make sure they're delivering the liquid properly. So if they haven't got liquids on the system, they need to go through that, which is not a cheap exercise. So that could be one of the barriers. And also knowing how to mix it can be a little bit of an issue to start with. But once guys know how to do it and get a system organised, they tend to cope pretty well. And also the logistics on the farm, so having another truck and tank and what have you to move around the farm can be something more to move and shift at seeding time when everyone's under pressure. So there are a couple of the barriers. In terms of cost per hectare, you sort of, depending on what rate, you're looking at around about early $22 a hectare. So that's about the cost per hectare. The benefits, I guess, are being able to go in with some confidence. As you know, a lot of the farmers are getting bigger programs, so it's not so much about the finish date, it's more about the start date. So if they're starting dry sowing in early April with their canolas and their lupins, they can use the soil wetter there, knowing that if they do get some follow-up rain, which may not be a season opening rain, but it might be a 5 to 10 mil rainfall event, it's usually enough to get their crop up and away. And probably the further east you go, if you can get canola out of the ground in April versus May, and depending on what happens later in the year, it can give you a better opportunity for improved yields. And we saw that at NRM in 2021, where we had canola out of the ground in April compared to where we didn't have the wetter, where it didn't come out of the ground, and significant yield improvement. The sales volume of the product have really gone through the roof over the last 5 or 6 years, and as I alluded to, there's most people who have started using the product continue to use it. And one of the other benefits, it may not be all in establishment, but it's just the evenness of the crop. So farmers are reporting back that when they're going to do their post-emergence spraying, all their canolas at the same stage, so it makes decisions easier rather than having some canola bolting and some 4-leaf canola, for example. So I guess one thing we have learned is that placement is really critical, so you have to have your bar set up properly, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But unless guys are going to get their bars set up right for the correct placement, and we've narrowed that down fairly precisely, it's not really worth doing unless you're going to do it properly. So that's one thing we've learned, along with other after things like rates, total water volume going out with it, etc. When we first started doing trials, we looked at the placement, and that was behind the press wheel, where you would think it would work the best because it would break down some of the surface tension on non-wetting soils and allow infiltration of water when it did rain. And we also looked at placing it behind the seed boot with the seed, because the way SE14 works, it actually draws moisture to it, so it's an attraction and retention agent. And we did some field trials using a grower's bar actually, and we found that we had a significant improvement when we placed it right with the seed as opposed to behind the press wheel. One thing we did learn also is that placing it down behind the opening tine, where the UAN traditionally goes, is a total waste of time. So unless growers are going to change their setup, if they've only got UAN set up, you won't get a result with it. So what we have seen is some guys actually using the one liquid system, and when they want to use UAN, they'll drop it down behind the opening tine, and they'll pull it out and actually drop it right behind the seed boot, and they might have some clamps or some other mechanism to do that, or even have 2 small Suzy coils to add with a tap system on it, so they can change over depending on where they want to direct the liquid. But that's really where it needs to go. So you have your liquid stream coming out on top, right on top of the seed, and then the press wheel rolls over it, and you end up with a small obviously stream of liquid. Usually about 50 litres a hectare is what total volume, and then as the moisture comes into it, it'll draw moisture from on top of the furrow, so obviously you get a bit of a water harvesting effect where the water sits on top, and it'll draw it down through that, or from the interrow, or even from below. And that small initial tube of moisture, once it gets some moisture around, you might have something the diameter of a 20-cent piece, for example, and your seed needs to be encapsulated in that moisture band, and you'll end up with a sausage of moisture down the furrow. In terms of rates, the standard rate is 3 litres a hectare of product, with a total volume of 50 litres per hectare going out. That's based on a 25 centimetre tine spacing. If you're going out to a 300 mil tine spacing, or 30 centimetre, you can reduce that rate back to 2.5 litres of product per hectare, and with the same water volume. So So obviously it's the concentration of product in the band is what we're looking at. And that's pretty much on a lighter soil type, a lighter sand. When we get into the forest gravels, being the higher the gravel content, the more responsive it is. So in a forest gravel, a lot of guys are getting really good results at 2 litres per hectare. So yeah, around that rate we're in the real gravel country. But where there's not much gravel and a lot of sand, you want to keep your rates up. Or the other thing to think about, some guys are using a paired row system. So if you've got a paired row, you've got 2 streams of seed coming out of the back of the boot. You need to actually split your liquid stream, so you've got a stream with either pair. What we have seen in the past is having a paired row with one liquid stream down the middle, and what's it worked out to be, the grower rang me up and said, oh, it's killed my crop, and what's happened, the liquid stream's actually drawn all the moisture away from the seed. So you really need to have a liquid stream with either stream, a liquid stream with either stream of seed.
Okay, so Michael Lamond, CEO of SLR Agriculture, based in York. So soil wetters have been around for quite a while, but recently there's been quite a few come on the market, and there's been a lot of work done in the last, sort of 5 or 6 years in the use of wetters, and we're finding that the main soil types that most growers target are those real classic non-wetting soils. The lighter sands, but we're also finding that they're going quite well in other soils, and so I suppose the adoption by growers has been quite widespread across the grain belt. Not just the typical non-wetting soils, but also in the gravel soils and quite a few of the other soils as well. So as far as yield gain goes, there generally is some yield gain across a whole paddock. What you find is with the use of wetters, you get much more even establishment. So the crop comes up more evenly, you get more plants per metre row, and you get that right across the whole paddock. So where you have varying soil types, rather than having sort of intermittent germination across the paddock, you'll get an even germination. When you get a nice even strike, of course, you get improved crop competition with weeds early on. You don't have the gaps in it that you can have if the crop's a little uneven. And of course, in those gaps, the weeds grow. So having a nice even establishment helps with crop competition, and it makes your crop protection, your treatment, your herbicides, the applications a lot easier, because your timing's a lot easier to hit the correct application windows, because the growth stage across the paddock is more even. Okay, so the other one is simply around risk mitigation. So, in a drying environment, we often get just low rainfall events at the start, and majority of the canola is actually sown dry, and these low rainfall events are critical in getting canola up early, and the wetters have a big role to play in that part, and we see that all the time. And you can get your canola up on a much lower rainfall event than if you don't have a wetter, and as I said, you get that across the whole paddock. Okay, so I suppose the most obvious one is canola. It's a small seed, we sow it shallow. If you're chasing moisture deep at the start of the season, there's a lot of risk in case you might get furrow filled from a wind event or heavy rainfall, and so you don't get the emergence. With wetters, you can sow shallower, and you can actually be following the moisture down, and you'll get a more even strike. So canola is the most obvious one, and it's also the crop that is sown dry the most. So it's the one that goes in first, and it's the one generally at greatest risk from dry sowing. So canola is an obvious one. There's been a lot of work done in the cereals and lupins, because again it's one that often goes in early. Lupins aren't quite as you're a little bit more forgiving with the lupins. You can sow them deeper, they're a bigger seed, and they can come up for a lot further. So you can actually chase moisture at the start of the season with lupins, to a greater extent than you can canola. But again, dry sowing, lupins, have the wetter there, and you will always get a better strike. Cereals, the cereals is a little bit more iffy, but we generally, on those really classic non-wetting soils, you will generally get a benefit. So it just really depends on it's a year-by-year basis really on, what percentage of the crop's going in dry. There's always some cereals sown dry, And in that case, you would generally benefit from a wetter as well for the same reasons that you do with canola. Yeah, okay, so the challenges, I suppose, are that you've got another liquid going out. And so you need, okay, how much UAN can you put out with your wetters? Or, can you put them together? Do you have to ban them separately? You also often have fungicides going out. So it's just that it's an extra liquid that's going out at seeding time. And the positioning of the wetters is quite critical to get the best benefit. You've really got to have the wetter sort of going from the bottom of the furrow right down to where the seed is. It's like a little channel it's like a channel that allows the water to get to where the seed is. So, but you've also, the proximity of your UAN to canola seed in particular can be very sensitive in emergence. You can only really have about 6 kilos of N that's anywhere near your seed, otherwise the emergence really suffers. And in a warm soil, and particularly in a drying environment, like a drying profile, warm, can be really toxic. So you have to be very careful where you put your UAN and how much. Well, crop germination, you generally almost always get an advantage, and just through more even establishment. The crop canopy development is impacted by the evenness of your emergence and how early it emerges. So generally with an even emergence and right across the paddock, you get a beautiful canopy across the paddock more easily and more uniformly. Growers that are using wetters, they just seem to have better establishment. It's really that simple. Yeah, I suppose in general, growers who have been using wetters for a while, they sort of figure out where they get the most benefit from. It's not in all soil types and not in all conditions, but they seem to figure it out after a few years. And they typically will start with canola, maybe use lupins, then go to cereals. Particularly in a sort of wet dry situation, you'll almost always get a benefit in a cereal in that situation. So I suppose my observation is when we do a lot of wetter trials, like for lots of different companies, and there's been a lot of really a real surge in the interest in the last few years. So we've done over-top applications, we've done seed coating comparisons, liquid down the tube. Liquids are better. They're always better. The seed coating ones, you don't seem to be able to get enough on the seed to make much of a benefit, and also the wetter is around the seed. It hasn't got that channel, that allows the water to get from the surface down to the seed. Yeah. Okay, so where are wetters going? I suppose as we're facing more difficult growing conditions, particularly at the start, more irregular rainfall events, the timing of the rainfall events, the intensity of the rainfall events, there is this, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximise the length of your growing season. So the earlier you can get your crop up, the better. The longer the growing season, generally the higher the yield. So I could see that they'll just be more and more used. If our climate variability continues the way it is, it's just one of those things that we can do to help mitigate those, the climate, the drier and more irregular rainfall events that we seem to be getting at the start of the season. I suppose my advice for growers who haven't tried wetters, who are interested in possibly trying wetters, there's a lot of literature out there, and there's a lot of good podcasts. There's a lot of stuff on the internet. Just probably take some time to have a look at what the various situations where you might get the most benefit. Try that first, and then and then probably do your research on the various different products. They don't really, in my experience, they're not really a lot different from each other, although there are some major differences in viscosity and ease of use and handling and things like that. So it is probably worth doing a little bit of homework and checking that out first. And that's just like you would do with any new thing that you try on your farm. Do some research and give it a crack.